Chicago, winter of 1912. Snow had been falling for hours, blanketing the narrow streets in silence. The houses stood shoulder to shoulder like weary sentinels, their brick faces dark against the pale sky. But on the corner of Wabash Avenue, one home looked different. Its shutters had been nailed shut for as long as anyone could remember. Curtains, faded, yellowing, hung stiff behind dust-caked windows. No laughter, no voices, no movement ever escaped from within. That night, a young boy delivering coal paused by the gate. Through the biting wind, he swore he heard something. A muffled cry, the faint sound of someone tapping on wood. It was brief, so soft he almost doubted it. But then it came again, a desperate, pleading knock. The house belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Dempsey. Widowed young, she had raised her 4 children alone in that looming structure. To the neighbors, she was a figure of contradiction, polite when spoken to, but cold, almost mechanical in her movements. She rarely left the house, and when she did, it was only at odd hours, clutching a worn black satchel. Rumors swirled. Some claimed she was hiding a fortune. Others whispered about illness, curses, or debts she didn't want anyone to see. But most simply avoided her. In a city where everyone minded their own business, the Dempsey house became a silent agreement. Best left alone. Yet that night, standing in the snow, the boy felt something more than curiosity. He felt dread. And what no one in that neighborhood yet realized was that behind those boarded shutters, 4 children were living in darkness, trapped in a world their mother had built, a prison with no bars, where time itself had been smothered. It would be another 3 months before the truth spilled into the papers, but by then, the damage had been done. It began with small, almost forgettable moments. A milkman who noticed his deliveries went unto, ched for days, only for the bottles to suddenly vanish overnight. A neighbor who swore she saw pale fingers pulling the curtain aside before snapping it shut. A foul, sour smell that drifted into the street on hot days and seemed to seep from the very bricks of the house. The Dempsey home had long been an oddity, but in early March of 1912, curiosity began to sour into suspicion. It was the postman, Mr. Grady, who took the first real step toward uncovering what lay within. He had been delivering letters to the address for years, but in the last 2 decades, he had never once seen the children whose names appeared on school rosters long ago. Year after year, they were marked absent until eventually, their names were quietly removed. One morning, Grady rapped on the door to deliver a registered letter. There was no answer, but just as he turned to leave, he thought he heard a faint shuffling inside, followed by a sound that froze him. A thin, high-pitched voice whispering, "Please?" Before he could respond, heavy footsteps approached from within. The door creaked open just enough for Mrs. Dempsey's narrow face to appear. Her eyes, sharp, unblinking, studied him like a hawk sizing up prey. She snatched the letter without a word and slammed the door so hard the glass panels rattled. It might have ended there had it not been for a census worker visiting the street later that week. Official records demanded the names and ages of all residents. When asked about her children, Mrs. Dempsey said they had moved away years ago. But something in her tone felt rehearsed, like an actor reciting a line for the 100th time. The census worker, uneasy, mentioned the encounter to a local beat officer, and that was when the stories started to align. The milkman, the postman, the neighbor who heard whispers. The officer filed a preliminary report, but it would take one more strange event to force the police to act. A delivery boy claiming he had seen a face. Thin, pale, and ghost-like, pressed against an upstairs window. The first knock on the Dempsey door had been ignored. The second would not be so polite. In 1912 Chicago, neighbors saw more than they said. It wasn't apathy so much as a survival instinct. The city's south side was thick with boarding houses, speakeasies, and rooms where the curtains stayed closed for a reason. If you kept to your own, you were less likely to invite trouble to your door. The Dempsey house fit neatly into that unspoken pact. People noticed oddities. Of course they did. The smell in summer. The way Mrs. Dempsey's front steps seemed to gather dust, as though no one had crossed them in years. The rare times she was seen outside, she wore the same faded black dress, her gloves buttoned tight even in July, as if to keep the world from touching her. Children in the neighborhood made a game of it. They dared each other to run up to the gate and touch the rusted latch, whispering about the witch inside. Their parents scolded them not because they feared Mrs. Dempsey's wrath, but because drawing her attention felt unsafe. One neighbor, Mrs. O'Malley, admitted later that she had once heard crying, soft, pitiful sounds coming from somewhere deep in the house. She'd stood at her kitchen sink, hands wet with dishwater, and listened until it stopped. She told herself it was a stray cat. She never asked. Others swore they had glimpsed figures in the upstairs windows, shadows moving against the dim lamplight. But when mentioned in passing, such talk was quickly smothered. No, one wanted to be the one who knocked. Part of the fear was Eleanor Dempsey herself. Though rarely seen, she had a way of making her presence felt. A glance from her could still a conversation mid-sentence. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were clipped, final. Once, when a boy tossed a ball into her yard, she appeared without sound and placed it back over the fence, her gloved fingers lingering on the leather as if reluctant to let it go. And so, for nearly 2 decades, the street carried on as if the Dempsey family were ghosts. Even as the rumors grew darker, even as the sense of something wrong settled heavy in the air, the neighborhood chose silence. Because in that part of Chicago, it was easier, safer, not to see at all. Eleanor Margaret Dempsey was not always the figure of dread she would become. Born in 1869 to an Irish dockworker and a seamstress, she grew up in a cramped tenement on the east side of the city. Her father's temper was notorious, his discipline swift and unquestioned. Her mother was quieter, but no less strict, with a belief that children were best seen and not heard. As a young woman, Eleanor was striking. Not beautiful in the traditional sense, but sharp-featured and deliberate in her movements. She carried herself with a kind of poise that seemed above her station. In 1890, she married Thomas Dempsey, a machinist who promised stability and a modest home. They had 4 children in quick succession, 3 girls and a boy. For a while, neighbors remembered the Dempsey home was ordinary. Eleanor was stern but present. She attended church on Sundays, shopped for her groceries herself, and even smiled, briefly, when spoken to. Then, in 1898, Thomas fell ill with pneumonia and died within weeks. His absence marked a visible shift. Eleanor stopped attending church. She stopped speaking to neighbors altogether. Most tellingly, she withdrew her children from school, citing illness and family matters. Those who knew her then recalled a growing suspicion in her manner. She spoke often about outsiders and how the world was rotting from the inside out. In her mind, the streets of Chicago were crawling with disease, both moral and physical. Strangers were threats. Friends could not be trusted. The only safety, she believed, was within her own walls. By 1900, her outings had dwindled to the barest necessity. She paid a delivery boy for groceries but instructed him to leave the parcels by the gate. The children were never seen again. When Eleanor did appear in public, she was almost unrecognizable. Thin, pale, with eyes that seemed to see straight through a person. Her black clothing became a constant, her gloves a barrier between herself and the world. and though no one could have guessed the extent of what she was doing inside her home, there was something in her gaze, a tightness, a calculating stillness, that unsettled even the bravest souls. The city would come to know her as the mother who kept her family locked away for 20 years. But to understand what she became, one must see the years of slow, deliberate withdrawal. The building of walls, both physical and in her own mind. Before the shutters were nailed shut and the front door bolted, the Dempsey household was alive with the ordinary sounds of a working-class family. In the mid-1890s, their home on Wabash Avenue was modest but well-kept. Tall and narrow brick structure with lace curtains in the front windows and a small vegetable garden in the back. Thomas Dempsey was the sort of father who came home with grease on his hands and a joke on his lips. On summer evenings, he would sit on the front stoop with his children, teaching them to carve whistles from scrap wood. Eleanor, though strict, would occasionally join in, sewing in her rocking chair, a faint smile betraying her otherwise rigid demeanor. The children, Margaret, Clara, Rose, and young Patrick, attended the local school, often returning with smudges of chalk on their sleeves or ink stains on their fingers. They played marbles in the dirt and hopscotch on the worn cobblestones. On Sundays, the family filled an entire pew at St. Ignatius Church, Thomas tipping his hat to neighbors on the way in. Photographs from that time, rare and fading, show a family that, on the surface, looked like any other. Thomas stands tall in a workman's jacket, Eleanor at his side in a high-collared dress, her hand resting stiffly on Margaret's shoulder. The children's expressions vary, Rose beaming, Clara shyly looking away, Patrick squinting against the sun. These moments, brief as they were, painted a picture of a family rooted in routine and modest comfort. But even then, there were cracks. Eleanor's discipline could be severe. A misplaced shoe or a scuffed dress was met with sharp words and days of silence. She disliked visitors and rarely allowed her children to play in other homes. Still, before Thomas's death, the home had windows open to the air, laughter in the evenings, and footsteps that came and went freely. The transformation from this ordinary domestic life to the suffocating confinement that followed was so gradual, so methodical, that those on the outside hardly noticed, until there was nothing left to notice at all. By the time neighbors realized they hadn't seen the Dempsey children in years, the family's former life existed only in yellowed photographs and the fading memories of those who once waved to them across the street. It happened in the winter of 1900, a little over a year after Thomas Dempsey's death. The day began like any other, cold wind cutting down the street, smoke curling from the chimneys. But something in Eleanor's demeanor had changed. That morning, she moved through the house with a determined precision, gathering tools and nails from the basement. The children watched from the parlor as she climbed a small ladder and began fastening the shutters over the front windows. At first, they assumed it was to keep out the draft, but she worked in silence, her face tight with concentration. By nightfall, every window on the ground floor had been sealed from the inside. She told them it was for their safety. The streets, she said, were no longer safe, filled with sickness, criminals, and temptations that would corrupt their souls. She spoke of outsiders as if they were predators lurking just beyond the fence. The children, still grieving their father, clung to her words. If their mother said the world was dangerous, who were they to doubt her? Within days, the front door was fitted with a heavy iron lock, the only key kept on a chain around Eleanor's neck. The back door, once leading to the small garden, was barred with a wooden plank so thick it took her an hour to wedge it into place. At first, life carried on in a strange imitation of normalcy. Lessons were taught at the dining table. Meals were cooked from pantry supplies, and Eleanor occasionally ventured out alone to fetch necessities. But her absences grew shorter, her returns more hurried. She began speaking less of keeping the family safe and more of keeping the family pure. When Margaret, the eldest, asked if she could visit a friend from school, Eleanor's reaction was swift and terrifying. Her voice, usually measured, rose into a sharp, shaking scream. "You will not leave this house again." From that moment, the children understood that the locked doors were not temporary. This was no storm to be waited out. It was the beginning of a life cut off from the world outside. And as the weeks turned into months, the house began to feel less like a home and more like something else entirely, a place that did not permit escape. By the spring of 1901, the Dempsey home no longer resembled the warm, modest dwelling it once was. It had begun to take on the character of its keeper, cold, rigid, and unyielding. Eleanor's changes were not cosmetic. They were calculated. She reinforced the shutters with additional boards, hammering them so tightly that not a sliver of daylight could slip through. The keyholes in the doors were covered with small metal plates fastened in place with tiny screws. Even the chimney flues were fitted with grates to prevent anything, or anyone, from climbing in or out. The upstairs hallway, once bright with morning sun, fell into permanent dusk. Oil lamps burned at set times, but Eleanor rationed the matches, lighting them only long enough to complete chores or read aloud from her Bible. The air grew stale, heavy with the smell of unwashed clothes and the dampness of sealed rooms. Eleanor's control extended to movement within the house. Certain rooms became off-limits without explanation. First the parlor, then the front bedrooms, until the family was confined to a handful of spaces. The kitchen table became the school desk, dining area, and prayer bench. The children began to notice changes in their own bodies. Their skin lost its summer color, paling to an almost translucent hue. Their muscles weakened from lack of space to run or climb. Patrick, the youngest, developed a persistent cough that echoed in the silence of the night. But it was the sound, or rather, the lack of it, that made the house feel like a true prison. The outside world was reduced to muffled fragments, the distant clip of horses' hooves, the murmur of voices on the street, the faint toll of the church bell. These reminders of life beyond the walls were fleeting and, in Eleanor's eyes, dangerous. She instructed the children to turn away from the windows, even the ones nailed shut. Visitors became unthinkably. If someone knocked, Eleanor would motion for the children to stay silent, her finger pressed firmly to her lips until the intruder left. Bit by bit, the home's walls ceased to be mere boundaries. They became barriers, and within them, the Dempsey family began to disappear from the world's memory, swallowed whole by the isolation their mother had crafted with her own hands. Life inside the Dempsey house fell into a rigid, unchanging rhythm, a rhythm dictated entirely by Eleanor's will. Days began before dawn, when the faint glow of an oil lamp cast long, trembling shadows across the kitchen. Eleanor would wake her children with a firm knock on their doors, never entering, only waiting until she heard the creak of bed springs and the shuffle of bare feet on the wooden floor. Breakfast was sparse. Usually porridge or stale bread softened in watered-down milk. Meat was a rarity, reserved for Sundays, and even then it was rationed so precisely that no plate held more than a few bites. Eleanor ate last, standing as though keeping watch. Lessons followed. The children were taught reading, arithmetic, and scripture at the same small table where they ate. There were no books besides the family Bible, a few battered school primers, and the occasional newspaper Eleanor brought home. Pages heavily censored with sections torn away. Writing was done on scraps of paper carefully saved and reused. Conversation was limited. Eleanor believed idle talk led to dangerous thoughts, so the children spoke only when answering questions. Laughter was rare. Whispering was forbidden. Any violation resulted in days of penance, which meant sitting silently in a darkened corner with nothing to do but think.
Si este video te gustó y te fue útil, suscríbete al canal y deja tu like. Así me ayudas a seguir creando más contenido como este.
Afternoons were devoted to chores, scrubbing floors, mending clothes, polishing what little silver remained from better days. The smallest infraction, such as a crooked seam or a missed speck of dust, was met with cutting words and, occasionally, the sharp sting of a slap. Eleanor's rules extended beyond behavior to movement. No child was to walk upstairs without permission, no door was to be opened without her say, and no one, under any circumstances, was to go near the front gate. The garden lay overgrown and unused, a patch of green glimpsed only through cracks in the shuttered boards. Nights were the most suffocating. The house grew eerily still, the lamps extinguished, leaving only the sound of the wind pressing against the shutters. The children lay in their beds, listening to the creak of floorboards as their mother made her rounds, checking locks, touching each doorknob to ensure it had not been turned. For the Dempsey children, days blurred into one another, the sameness pressing down like a weight. Weeks could pass without a single reminder that there was a city, a street, a world just beyond those nailed-shut windows. The change in the Dempsey children was not sudden. It crept in like a slow-moving fog, almost invisible at first, until it was impossible to ignore. Margaret, once bright-eyed and quick to smile, began speaking less and less. Her posture curved inward as though she were trying to take up less space in a world that had no room for her. Clara developed a habit of staring at the floor for long stretches, her lips moving in silent repetition of Bible verses, as if reciting them might keep her mind from drifting into forbidden thoughts. Rose, the youngest daughter, stopped asking questions altogether. She had been the curious one, the child who once followed her father into the garden, peppering him with inquiries about plants, insects, and the sky. No, you. Her gaze rarely lifted from her hands, which she kept folded neatly in her lap at all times. Patrick, the only boy, fared the worst physically. His cough grew more persistent, his frame thin enough that his collarbones jutted sharply against his skin. With no fresh air, no sunlight, and a diet stripped of nourishment, his body simply could not keep pace with his growing bones. Their world had shrunk to a handful of rooms, and so had their imaginations. Play was no longer running or laughing. It was the silent arranging of buttons, the tracing of shapes into dust, the quiet passing of folded notes under a table when Eleanor's back was turned. The children's skin took on a pallor that even the flickering lamplight could not disguise. Their eyes seemed too large for their faces, framed by dark circles. Illness lingered longer, bruises healed slower, and every movement carried a weariness far beyond their years. More disturbing was the emotional toll. The boundaries of fear shifted constantly. Some days Eleanor was quiet and withdrawn, watching from the corner of the room. Other days, her temper snapped without warning, a sharp word or sudden slap leaving the children frozen in place. They learned to read the smallest changes in her tone, the faintest twitch of her hands. Skills born not of curiosity, but survival. It was during this time that the Dempsey children began to lose track of how long they had been locked away. Days, weeks, seasons. Each bled into the next until time itself felt irrelevant. What mattered was only this. Eleanor held the key, and the outside world might as well have been on another planet. Margaret had been only 10 when the shutters were first nailed shut. By the time she turned 16, she had spent more than half her life under her mother's lock and key. But unlike her younger siblings, she could still remember the feel of sunlight on her face, the sound of laughter spilling from the street, the smell of bread baking at the corner shop. Those memories were her quiet rebellion. They reminded her that another life had once existed, and perhaps could again. She never spoke openly about escape. Eleanor's rules were absolute, and any suggestion of disobedience was met with swift punishment. But Margaret's mind began to work in small, careful ways. She memorized the sound of her mother's footsteps on the stairs, the pattern of her nightly rounds, the precise moments when the key was removed from Eleanor's neck. Usually when she knelt in prayer, eyes closed and lips moving silently. Margaret's resistance was subtle at first. She began hiding small crumbs of bread or bits of apple from her own rations, tucking them into a loose floorboard in the corner of her room. She collected pins, bits of wire, and scraps of cloth, though she had no clear plan for them. Only the knowledge that someday, somehow, they might be useful. She also started to test the boundaries. If Eleanor told her to remain in the kitchen, she would edge toward the parlor, just far enough to glimpse the hallway beyond. If told not to touch a particular drawer, she would lift it an inch when her mother's back was turned, committing its contents to memory. Her siblings noticed the small defiance, though they dared not copy it. Patrick would look at her with wide, nervous eyes whenever she moved too close to the locked doors. Clara whispered once, barely audible, "She'll find out." Margaret only shook her head. "Not if I'm careful." In the suffocating stillness of the Dempsey home, Margaret's quick at plotting was like a spark buried deep in kindling, too faint to see but alive all the same. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, for the perfect set of circumstances to make her move. That moment, she believed, would come. But in the years to follow, she would learn that timing was both her greatest ally and her most dangerous enemy. Eleanor Dempsey did not merely lock her children away. She watched them. Her brand of vigilance was relentless, methodical, and unnervingly inventive for 1912. In an age before electricity reached every home, she found ways to turn her two-story house into a web of observation and control. Every door had not just a lock, but a secondary latch hidden behind a panel only accessible from her side. She had drilled tiny peepholes through the walls, concealing them behind lace doilies or framed photographs. From these vantage points, she could see into the children's bedrooms, the kitchen, even the narrow hallway where they sometimes paced for exercise. She memorized every creak of the floorboards. If a step sounded out of place, slightly too quick, too slow, or too far from the usual path. Eleanor would appear silently, her face expressionless, demanding to know what had caused the deviation. Her arrival was so swift and so silent that the children half believed she could materialize from the walls. Eleanor also developed a system of auditory cues. Strings with small brass bells were tied just above door hinges so that even a fraction of movement would send a delicate chime through the house. If someone tried to muffle the bell with a hand, she would still hear the faint shift of the metal against the wood. At night, she would sit in the upstairs hallway with a knitting basket in her lap, claiming she was too restless to sleep. The needles clicked rhythmically, but her eyes were always on the shadows beneath the doors, watching for the telltale flicker of candlelight when the children were supposed to be asleep. It wasn't just physical surveillance. Eleanor kept a strict mental record of every word spoken in the house. She would question the children days later about something they'd said, testing them for contradictions. Even the smallest slip in their answers would lead to days of confinement in the attic as punishment. In her mind, this was not cruelty. It was vigilance, a form of love. She told herself that she was keeping them pure, safe from the corruption of the outside world. But in truth, her constant observation eroded their sense of self until they felt less like children and more like specimens under glass. And all the while, Margaret, the eldest, began to realize that Eleanor's watchfulness wasn't perfect. There were gaps, small ones, but they were there. It began with a whisper between sisters. Margaret had been studying the patterns of their mother's movements for weeks. The way Eleanor always lingered longer in the kitchen after the noon meal, how she occasionally left the upstairs hallway unattended to fetch something from the basement pantry. One overcast Thursday in early March, Margaret decided the opportunity had finally come. The plan was simple. She would slip downstairs, unlatch the back door, and hide outside in the overgrown yard until night. Fall. From there, she would make for the street and find help. She didn't tell all of her siblings, only Clara, the second eldest, because she feared one of the younger ones might blurt something out in front of Eleanor. Even so, Clara's hands trembled as she tied a scarf around Margaret's neck that morning, whispering, "Don't get caught, please." The moment arrived when Eleanor went down to the basement, humming to herself, the faint clink of glass jars marking her descent. Margaret's heart thundered in her chest as she tiptoed down the creaking stairs, careful to step only on the edges where the wood was least likely to groan. At the back of the house, the heavy door loomed. The key was still in the lock, a stroke of luck Margaret had not expected, but when she turned it, the mechanism gave a loud clack. She froze, listening. No sound of footsteps. She turned it the rest of the way and pulled. The door did not move. Margaret tried again, harder. That's when she realized the wood was swollen from years of humidity. It stuck tight to the frame like a coffin lid. She pressed her shoulder into it, gritting her teeth, but the stubborn frame only groaned in protest. And then she heard it. Footsteps. Quick, deliberate, unmistakable. Eleanor's voice was calm, almost curious. "Margaret, what are you doing?" When Margaret turned, her mother was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She wasn't shouting, wasn't angry, but the expression in her eyes was enough to freeze Margaret in place. That night, there was no supper for Margaret. Instead, Eleanor locked her in the attic with nothing but a thin blanket. The darkness was total, the air stale, and in that stillness, Margaret made herself a silent promise. Next time, she would be ready. The attic punishment did something to Margaret. It was more than hunger or the ache in her joints from the cold. It was the way Eleanor had looked at her, not with fury, but with quiet disappointment, as though Margaret had committed a sin against the family's very existence. When she was finally allowed back downstairs, Eleanor acted as if nothing had happened. She served Margaret a bowl of thin soup and even smoothed her hair with an almost tender hand. But in that moment, Margaret knew. Her mother's calm was not mercy, it was control. From that day forward, Margaret's rebellion went underground. She no longer tried to openly challenge her mother's rules. Instead, she began watching, listening, learning. She memorized which floorboards creaked the loudest and at what times of day the sound of passing streetcars could mask movement. She learned which windows were painted shut and which, if nudged just so, could be coaxed open a fraction without the frame groaning. Margaret also began hiding things. A stub of candle stolen from the kitchen drawer, a rusted spoon she flattened against the floorboards until it formed a crude prying tool. Scraps of paper where she scribbled reminders about Eleanor's patterns. When she left to fetch water, when she lingered in the parlor to listen to her gramophone. Clara noticed first. "You're different," she whispered one night, their cots side by side in the upstairs room. "What are you doing?" Margaret didn't answer at first. She didn't trust anyone completely, not even her sister, but over time, she began dropping hints, small instructions. If I tell you to be ready, you must be ready. Do, and ask questions. Meanwhile, Eleanor seemed oblivious. Or perhaps she simply believed her authority was unshakable. She continued her strict routines, serving the same bland meals, inspecting the children's hands before bed to make sure they hadn't been prying at doors or windows. But Margaret's silence was not compliance. It was preparation. Every nod, every "yes, mother," was a brick in the disguise she was building. The truth was, she had stopped thinking like a trapped child. She was thinking like a prisoner planning an escape. And in the stillness of night, when the rest of the house slept, she would stare at the faint line of moonlight across the floorboards and imagine it was the first crack in the walls around her life. It was late autumn when Margaret first saw him. She had been standing in the narrow upstairs hallway, pretending to dust the sill of the small side window when movement in the alley below caught her eye. A man, perhaps in his mid-30s, was lingering by the brick wall across the street. He was not dressed like a peddler or a laborer. His coat was clean, his hat brim low over his eyes. And unlike passers-by who barely glanced at the house, he seemed to be watching it. Margaret froze. She knew the rules. No waving, no speaking, no drawing attention. But she also knew opportunities came rarely, if at all. When the man shifted his gaze upward, their eyes met for the briefest second. It was enough to make her heart race. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply looked at her as though silently confirming that someone was inside. Then, the faintest motion. He tapped the side of his coat pocket twice before walking away. Margaret's mind spun. Was it a signal? A coincidence? She couldn't ask anyone. Eleanor's ears were everywhere, and Clara was still too fearful to be trusted with such a dangerous detail. That night, she barely slept. She replayed the scene over and over, wondering if the stranger would return. And when morning came, she found herself drawn back to the same spot, peeking through the curtain as inconspicuously as possible. 2 days later, he did return, this time carrying a small paper parcel. He walked by slowly, glanced up once, and kept moving. The parcel disappeared into his coat pocket as if he'd never had it. Margaret's pulse quickened. Something was happening, and whether it was fate or sheer chance, she felt certain it was her chance. That afternoon, she slipped the rusted spoon from its hiding place and began prying at the smallest window frame in the house. A tiny pane in the attic. It was barely wide enough for her arm, but it might be enough to send a note, if she could find the courage to write one. Downstairs, Eleanor's voice rang out, calling the children for supper. The smell of boiled cabbage drifted up the stairwell, heavy and familiar. But to Margaret, the air felt different now. Charged, dangerous, alive. Somewhere beyond those walls, a stranger knew she existed. And that meant the prison her mother had built might not be impenetrable after all. The attic window had always been a useless thing. Too small to climb through, too high to be of any real use. But for Margaret, it was now the only place in the house that felt like a possible lifeline. For days, she rehearsed in her mind what she might say if she dared to write a message. Every version seemed either too vague to matter or too dangerous to survive discovery. She knew Eleanor's punishments well. Disobedience was met with swift, calculated cruelty. A wrong step could bring worse than a beating. It could bring total isolation. On the morning she decided to act, the sky hung low and gray, the city sounds muted under a fine drizzle. Eleanor was downstairs, her heavy steps moving between the kitchen and pantry. Margaret took her moment. She tore a strip from the lining of her old apron, small enough to conceal, but large enough to scrawl a few desperate words. Using the burnt tip of a matchstick, she wrote with a shaking hand, "We are here. Need help. 4 children. Mother keeping us inside." It looked pitiful, the words uneven and smudged, but it was all she could manage. Folding it tightly, she slid the note into the hollow handle of a broken curtain rod she had stashed in the attic weeks ago. When the familiar figure appeared in the alley that afternoon, she nearly lost her nerve. He was walking faster this time, his hat pulled low, his eyes sweeping the street as though looking for someone or avoiding someone. Margaret timed it with a pounding heart. The moment he passed beneath the attic window, she leaned out just enough to let the small paper-wrapped rod drop. It fell silently into the shadows near his feet. For a terrible second, she thought he hadn't noticed. Then, without breaking stride, he stooped, scooped it up, and slipped it into his pocket. No glance upward, no sign of acknowledgement, just a smooth, practiced movement, as if this had been part of his plan all along. Margaret withdrew quickly, closing the warped pane and tucking herself against the wall, heart thundering so hard she thought Eleanor might hear it through the floorboards. Hours passed with no consequence, no alarm. Supper came and went. The children ate in silence under their mother's cold gaze. But deep inside, Margaret knew something had shifted. For the first time in 20 years, a sliver of the outside world had pierced through their prison. And maybe, just maybe, it was about to break it wide open. Eleanor had a sixth sense for betrayal. Her children often wondered if she could smell it, some hidden instinct that alerted her before a single word was spoken or a single step was taken. 3 days after Margaret dropped the note, that sense seemed to flare like a storm brewing in her bones. It began with the blinds. Eleanor had always been meticulous about them, ensuring they hung at precise angles to block both prying eyes and wandering light. But now she moved through the rooms with a sharper precision, tugging cords tighter, checking the attic latch twice, even dragging a heavy dresser in front of the parlor window. "Too many people on the street lately," she muttered, not looking at anyone in particular. "Too many eyes where they shouldn't be." Margaret kept her head down, hands busy with peeling potatoes, but her mind raced. Had the man in the alley done something? Did he speak to someone? Or worse, was Eleanor already aware that Margaret had made contact? That night, the children were sent to bed earlier than usual, the oil lamp extinguished before the clock struck 9. Eleanor stayed awake in the kitchen, her chair angled toward the back door, the faint glow of her cigarette ember marking her presence like a watchman's lantern. By the second night, the tension had spread through the house like damp in the walls. Eleanor began pacing after dusk, pausing ever, so often to peer through the keyhole in the front door or press her ear to the plaster. On the third night, she made an unannounced trip into the attic. The creak of her footsteps on the narrow stairs was enough to send Margaret's pulse hammering in her ears. She heard Eleanor shifting boxes, the scrape of furniture legs on the floorboards. Then a long pause. When Eleanor came down, her face was unreadable. Calm, almost serene. But Margaret recognized that calm. It was the kind of stillness that came before one of her mother's storms. The next morning, Eleanor announced new rules. No one was to enter the attic without her permission. The kitchen windows were to remain shuttered at all times, and most chilling of all, anyone caught speaking to someone outside this family, she said, her voice low and deliberate, will wish they'd never been born. Margaret swallowed hard. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was the hunt. For days, Margaret half expected to hear news that the stranger had been arrested, or worse, that Eleanor had found him. but instead he reappeared exactly 1 week after their first encounter, as though nothing in the world had changed. It was early evening, the sky over Chicago bruised purple with the promise of rain. Eleanor had sent the younger children to bed, leaving Margaret to wash the supper dishes alone. She was scrubbing a chipped plate when she caught movement outside the kitchen window. There he was, same brown coat, same brimmed hat, same careful stillness that made him seem part of the shadows. Margaret's stomach knotted. She glanced toward the door to make sure it was shut, then wiped her hands and stepped closer to the glass. He didn't move until she leaned just slightly to one side. Then, with a barely perceptible motion, he held up a small, folded scrap of paper. Margaret froze. If she took it, she'd be breaking every one of Eleanor's new rules. But if she didn't, she might lose her only chance to escape. She hesitated only a moment before unhooking the latch and sliding the window open an inch. Rain-scented air swept into the room. "Not safe," the man murmured, his voice low and urgent. "She's watching you." Margaret's breath caught. "Who are you?" she whispered. He shook his head. "No time. Read this when you're alone." He slipped the paper through the gap, and for a moment his gloved fingers brushed hers. Cold, trembling. Then he stepped back into the alley, disappearing into the mist like he'd never been there. Margaret shut the window, heart pounding so hard it hurt. She tucked the paper into the sleeve of her dress just as footsteps echoed in the hall. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her eyes scanning the kitchen. "You finished the dishes?" "Yes, Mother," Margaret said, forcing herself to keep her tone steady. Eleanor studied her for a long, unbearable moment, then nodded and turned away, but Margaret noticed the way her mother's eyes lingered on the window latch before she left. When the house was finally quiet, Margaret unfolded the note beneath the covers of her bed. The message was short, written in a hurried scrawl. "Help is coming. 3 nights from now. Be ready." Margaret didn't sleep that night. The stranger's note burned in her mind like a brand, each word carved into her thoughts. Help is coming. 3 nights from now. 3 nights, 72 hours. Every second counted. The next morning, she began her preparations in silence. She couldn't risk writing anything down. Eleanor had a way of finding hidden scraps of paper and would question her mercilessly over a single unexplained word. Instead, Margaret kept the plan in her head, replaying it over and over until it became a rhythm as natural as breathing. The first step was to find something to carry food. She waited until Eleanor sent her to fetch water from the storage room, then took a small cloth sack from an old pile of laundry. She slipped it under her dress when she returned to the kitchen. That afternoon, while Eleanor busied herself sewing in the parlor, Margaret quietly set aside pieces of bread and 2 apples from the pantry. It wasn't much, but she knew they couldn't carry anything heavy, especially if they had to run. She wrapped them in a handkerchief and buried the bundle beneath the loose floorboard under her bed. The real challenge was getting her siblings to cooperate without alerting Eleanor. The younger ones, Clara and Henry, had been born into confinement. To them, the dim rooms and barred windows were the world. Freedom was a word without meaning. That night, when Eleanor retired early, Margaret gathered the children in the farthest corner of the attic. She spoke barely above a whisper. 3 nights from now, we're leaving, she said. A man is going to help us. We have to be ready. No noise, no questions. When I tell you to move, you move. Clara's eyes widened. What if Mother catches us? Margaret swallowed hard. She won't. I promise. She didn't let them see the doubt gnawing at her stomach. Over the next 2 days, she timed Eleanor's movements like a soldier mapping an enemy's patrol. She memorized which floorboards groaned loudest, which doors creaked when opened, which times of night Eleanor slipped into her room for unannounced inspections. By the third night, Margaret had reduced her plan to its bare essentials: grab the food, wake the children, get to the back door, and follow the stranger into the darkness. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Eleanor had been watching her just as closely. The night was darker than usual, the kind of black that swallows even the faintest outlines of the street lamps beyond the curtains. Rain tapped steadily against the roof, masking the softer sounds inside the house. For Margaret, it was a blessing. Every drop was another layer of camouflage. She waited until the grandfather clock downstairs struck 2. By then, Eleanor's breathing, slow, deep, deliberate, could be heard through the thin walls. Margaret knew it well, the rhythm of a sleeping predator. Moving with care, she slipped out of bed and pried up the loose floorboard. The bundle of food was still there. Her heart thudded against her ribs as she tied it to her waist beneath her nightdress. She crept to Clara and Henry first, gently shaking them awake. Clara's eyes fluttered open, confusion quickly replaced by fear when she saw Margaret's urgent finger pressed to her lips. Henry stirred silently, clutching his small blanket like a shield. They tiptoed through the hallway, their bare feet avoiding the loudest boards. Every creak felt like an explosion in the silence. Twice, Margaret froze mid-step, sure she had heard the rustle of movement from Eleanor's room. Finally, they reached Thomas's bed. He was older, nearly Margaret's age, and had always been the most skeptical of escape. But when she leaned in and whispered, "It's time," he didn't argue, just nodded grimly and rose. The four of them descended the back staircase, the one that led directly to the kitchen. Beyond the kitchen door was the back entryway, and beyond that, freedom. Margaret's fingers trembled as she reached for the latch. She could almost smell the damp air from outside. She could feel the chill of night pressing against the wood. Then came the sound. A soft, deliberate click from behind them. Margaret froze, the children turning slowly toward the stairs. There, halfway down the steps, stood Eleanor. She was barefoot, her white nightgown clinging to her like a specter's shroud. In her right hand she held the large brass key that locked the back door. Her eyes, unblinking, fixed on Margaret. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady, deadly calm. "Going somewhere, my dear?" The key twirled slowly in her fingers, the faint chime of metal on metal slicing through the sound of the rain. The silence stretched like a rope pulled too tight. Margaret could feel the children trembling behind her, every breath shallow, every heartbeat loud enough to betray them. Eleanor descended the remaining steps with measured grace, as though she had all the time in the world. Her bare feet made no sound, but the weight of her presence pressed against the children like a physical force. "I have been so patient with you," she said, her tone laced with something that almost sounded like disappointment. "I feed you, I keep you safe from the sickness and the filth outside, and this is how you repay me." Margaret's mouth opened, but the words lodged in her throat. She tried to step in front of Clara and Henry, shielding them from what was coming. Eleanor's eyes caught the motion, and that was all it took. She surged forward with sudden, terrifying speed, snatching Margaret by the wrist. The bundle of food hidden beneath her nightdress fell to the floor with a dull thud. Eleanor's gaze snapped to it, and something inside her seemed to shatter. "You were going to leave me?" she hissed, yanking Margaret so hard she nearly lost her footing. "You were going to abandon this family, like he did?" The children flinched at the mention of he, a figure never spoken of openly but woven into Eleanor's rage. Thomas stepped forward, his voice cracking but defiant. "We're not prisoners. You can't keep us here forever." Eleanor's head turned toward him slowly, and the air in the room shifted. The fury in her eyes was no longer just anger. It was something deeper, more dangerous. "You think the world will be kind to you?" she said, her voice rising. "You think they'll take you in? You'll end up starving in an alley, or worse, buried in a pauper's grave." With one swift motion, she shoved Margaret toward the wall, the impact rattling the shelves. Dishes clattered and shattered on the floor. Clara whimpered, clutching Henry, who buried his face in her shoulder. The rain outside was now a roar, and lightning flashed through the kitchen window, illuminating Eleanor's pale, furious face. She looked almost inhuman in that brief burst of light. A figure carved from wrath itself. When she spoke again, her voice was trembling but cold. "No one leaves this house alive." The silence after Eleanor's threat was suffocating. The children stood frozen, every muscle locked, waiting to see if she would lunge again. The only sounds were the rain hammering against the windows and the faint rattle of the why and sneaking through the cracks in the old house. Margaret steadied herself against the wall, her shoulder throbbing where she had hit it. Her eyes flicked to Thomas. She didn't have to say anything. He understood. Something had to happen now, or they would never get another chance. Thomas's fists clenched at his sides. His mind was racing. He had spent years swallowing his words, obeying out of fear. But something inside him had been smoldering for too long. Eleanor's threat had poured gasoline on it. When Eleanor turned her back for a moment to shove the fallen food bundle into the stove, Thomas moved. It wasn't a calculated plan. It wasn't bravery in the noble sense. It was survival. He lunged forward, grabbing the iron poker from the hearth. His hands shook, not from weakness, but from the sheer adrenaline flooding his veins. "Put that down," Eleanor said without turning, her voice icy. "You don't want to do this, Thomas." But he did. "I'm not your prisoner," he said, his voice louder than he'd expected. "None of us are." The words seemed to slice the air in two. Eleanor slowly turned, her face unreadable. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then she stepped toward him. That was the breaking point. Thomas swung, not at her, but at the old wooden doorframe just inches from her head. The wood splintered with a loud crack, and the force of the blow seemed to reverberate through the entire house. Clara screamed. Henry started to cry. Margaret seized the moment, grabbing Clara and Henry by the hands. Eleanor's calm shattered. She lunged for Thomas, but he sidestepped, heart pounding. "Run!" he shouted. The kitchen erupted into chaos. Chairs toppling, glass breaking, feet pounding on the warped floorboards. Eleanor's fury turned into something more primal, almost desperate, as she tried to block the way. But the children were moving now, driven by a mix of terror and the sudden taste of freedom. And Thomas knew, whether they escaped tonight or not. There was no going back. The fear that had kept them quiet for 20 years had finally broken. The moment the front door burst open, the outside world hit them like a living thing. A wall of cold rain lashed their faces, driven sideways by a vicious wind. The storm had grown darker since they'd last dared to peek through the shuttered windows. Thunder rumbled somewhere deep above, echoing between the narrow streets of Chicago's South Side. Margaret pushed Clara and Henry ahead of her, shielding their small bodies from the wind as best she could. The cobblestones beneath their feet were slick, water rushing in little rivers toward the gutters. Their bare soles slipped on the uneven ground, but they didn't dare slow down. Behind them, the door slammed. Eleanor's voice sliced through the roar of the storm, a shriek that didn't sound entirely human. It was impossible to tell if she was yelling words or just releasing some primal howl of rage. Thomas grabbed Margaret's hand and pulled her toward the narrow alley that led to the old market road. "This way!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. They splashed through puddles that soaked their threadbare clothes, each step feeling heavier as the water clung to the fabric. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating their pale, frantic faces for an instant. For the first time in years, they were outside the suffocating walls of the house, and yet the city itself felt like a maze. Unknown, cold, and hostile. The alley narrowed, walls on either side rising like damp cliffs. Water dripped from fire escapes and streamed down the bricks. Somewhere far off, a church bell tolled, distorted by the storm. Margaret risked a glance back. Through the rain, she saw her mother, Eleanor, silhouetted in the doorway. She wasn't running after them yet. She just stood there, her figure blurred by the downpour, watching. That was worse than if she'd been chasing them. "Keep going," Thomas urged, his grip tightening. "Don't look back." They emerged from the alley onto a dimly lit street, gas lamps flickering in the wind. A trolley clanged in the distance, its light wavering like a ghost in the rain. For the first time, the siblings realized they had no plan, no safe place to go, no money, no one they could trust. But one thing was certain. If they stopped now, Eleanor would find them, and the storm outside would be the least of their fears. They stumbled down the nearly empty street, rain pounding so hard it blurred the gaslights into hazy smears of yellow. The sound of their own footsteps, wet, uneven, desperate, was all they could hear until a voice cut through the downpour. "You're going to catch your death out here!" The words came from a tall man standing beneath a black umbrella. His coat was buttoned high, collar turned against the wind, and his hat brim dripped with rainwater. Even in the storm's dim light, his face was partially obscured, only his sharp jaw and pale lips clearly visible. Margaret instinctively pulled Clara and Henry closer, her body forming a barrier. Thomas stepped forward, trying to stand between the stranger and his sisters. The man tilted the umbrella to cover them, blocking the worst of the rain. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice calm but oddly deliberate, like each word was weighed before spoken. "Where are your parents?" The siblings exchanged a glance. None of them dared answer. The man's gaze lingered on them for a moment, unreadable. Then he crouched slightly to look at Clara, who was shivering uncontrollably. "You're freezing. There's a boarding house just 2 streets over. I can take you there." Margaret's heart thudded. A stranger offering shelter could be a blessing, or the beginning of another trap. Thomas hesitated. We can manage." The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "In this weather, I think not. Follow me." He turned, walking toward a side street without waiting for their answer. The umbrella moved with him, inviting them to step into its dry shadow or remain in the storm. Margaret looked back down the street. Through the sheets of rain, the figure of Eleanor was gone, but that didn't mean she had stopped searching. A flash of lightning revealed the man waiting at the corner, glancing over his shoulder as though making sure they were still there. "We don't have a choice," Thomas muttered, grabbing Margaret's arm. One by one, they stepped under the umbrella, the closeness forcing them against the stranger's side. His coat smelled faintly of tobacco and something sharper, chemical, almost metallic. He led them away from the main road, deeper into the city's warren of narrow streets. Margaret had the sinking feeling that they hadn't escaped danger at all. They'd merely traded one kind for another. The building loomed at the end of the narrow lane, its facade worn and streaked with rain, the windows like blank, unblinking eyes. A single gas lamp flickered above the doorway, casting just enough light to reveal the peeling paint and war. Ped wood. "This is it," the man said, giving the door a sharp knock. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the house were mostly hollow inside. From somewhere within came the shuffling of feet. After a long pause, the door opened a crack, revealing an old woman whose hair was the color of dirty snow. Her eyes were sharp and darting, scanning the children before settling on the stranger. "They'll do?" she asked in a voice that rasped like dry paper. The man nodded. "Storm's bad tonight. Thought you might have a room." The woman's gaze flicked over Margaret, Thomas, and Clara in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl. She opened the door wider, the hinges groaning, and gestured them inside. The air was stale and heavy with the scent of boiled cabbage and something darker, something that smelled faintly of rot. The hallway was narrow, lined with faded wallpaper whose floral pattern had long since bled into muddy smears. A single candle burned in a wall sconce, its light barely reaching the far end of the corridor. The man closed the umbrella and stepped back into the night, offering no goodbye. The door shut behind him with a hollow thud, the sound final, like the closing of a vault. "This way," the woman said, her voice low. Her steps were surprisingly quick for her age, her slippered feet whispering across the warped floorboards. They passed several closed doors. From behind one came a faint, rhythmic creaking. From another, the muffled sound of someone crying. Clara tightened her grip on Margaret's hand. At the top of the stairs, the woman stopped in front of a small, dimly lit room. Two narrow beds sat against the wall, their blankets thin and patched. A single window was nailed shut, the glass clouded with condensation. "You'll be safe here," the woman said, though her tone was devoid of reassurance. "Lock the door from the inside. Some of the other guests wander at night." Before they could ask what she meant, she shuffled away, her shadow stretching unnaturally long down the hall. Margaret listened to her footsteps fade, the oppressive silence rushing in to fill the space. "Safe," the woman had said. But Margaret knew better. This place was not a refuge. It was another cage. Margaret lay awake long after Clara's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep. The rain tapped against the nailed-shut window, each drop a reminder of the world they could no longer reach. She stared into the darkness, her mind turning over the events that had led them here. From the cramped rooms of their mother's house to this suffocating boarding house. It was a different building, yes, but the feeling was the same. The locked doors, the stale air, the unspoken rules. Freedom was something they had glimpsed but never touched. In the hallway beyond their room, the creak of floorboards came and went, slow and deliberate. Sometimes the sound would pause outside their door, lingering just long enough to make her heart pound before shuffling away again. She could not tell if it was the old woman or one of the other guests she had warned them about. Margaret turned her head to look at Thomas. He was curled up, his face pressed into the thin pillow, his small hands twitching in dreams. She wondered if he too. He sensed that they had only traded one prison for another. She thought of her mother, still somewhere in Chicago, perhaps peering through her own locked window, perhaps pacing in another dim room. A woman whose mind had made a cage and whose hands had enforced it. Margaret knew then that the walls didn't have to be made of wood and nails to hold someone captive. Sometimes they were made of fear, sometimes of memory, and those were harder to escape. The candle sputtered in its holder, sending a long, crooked shadow across the room. Margaret closed her eyes, but sleep would not come. Some cages, she realized, you carry with you.